Welcome to the lost pages of history. In the grand saga of the American West, we remember the names of Geronimo, of Cochise, of Sitting Bull. Their legends are carved into the bedrock of history. But what if I told you that one of the greatest spiritual leaders and guerrilla fighters of the era, a warrior so revered their own chief called them his right hand, has been almost entirely erased from the story? This isn't a story about a chief or a famous male warrior. This is the story of a woman whose power was said to be a direct gift from the heavens, a holy warrior whose abilities defied belief. This is the story of Lozen, the shocking claim that in the heat of battle, with her people's fate hanging in the balance, Lozen could perform a sacred ritual. She would stand, arms outstretched, chanting to Usan, the Creator. As she turned, the palms of her hands would tingle and her veins would turn a deep dark blue, a living compass pointing directly to the hidden enemy. This wasn't mere folklore. It was a divine power that saved her people time and time again, a miracle of the battlefield that made her a legend. How could such a figure, a warrior prophetess, the Apache Joan of Arc, be forgotten? To understand her, we must go back before the arrival of the United States, to a time when Apacheria was a vast, untamed land, and the Apache were masters of the desert. Born around 1840, Lozen of the Shihenkirakwa Apache was sister to the great chief Victorio. From her earliest days, she walked a different path. While other girls learned the vital arts of the lodge, Lozen was in the saddle. She rode with the speed of the desert wind, her skills with a horse, a rifle, and a blade matching any man in the band. She saw the world through the eyes of a protector, her heart burning with a fierce love for her people. This fire was forged in tragedy. As a child, she witnessed the treachery of Mexican soldiers who, under a flag of truce, gifted poison supplies and then slaughtered her people. This brutal lesson taught her that survival depended not on trust but on strength and cunning. She refused all offers of marriage, dedicating her life not to a single family but to the entire tribe. She undertook the grueling trials of a warrior in training, pushing her body and spirit to their absolute limits, emerging not just as a warrior but as a holy woman. It was during her solitary puberty rite, alone in the sacred mountains, that the Creator bestowed upon her the greatest gift, the power to see the unseen. This was the birth of her legend. She was no longer just Lozen, the sister of Victorio. She was Lozen, the shield of her people, their seer, their strategist, their hope. Her story was just beginning, and it would be written in the dust and blood of the coming wars, a testament to a power and a spirit that refused to be broken. The world was changing, and the arrival of the White Eyes would test her and her divine gift as never before. The arrival of the White Eyes was not a gentle tide, but a flood. In 1848, with the stroke of a pen, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo redrew the map, and Apacheria, the land Lozen's people had roamed for generations, was declared United States territory. The California gold rush followed, a torrent of miners and settlers, carving paths through the heart of their homeland. The sacred lands were desecrated, the game driven away, and the Apache way of life was threatened as never before. The U.S. government, seeking to control the Indian problem, began a policy of forced relocation. In 1877, Victorio, Lozen, and their band were forced from their beloved Dojo Calinti homeland in New Mexico to the desolate San Carlos Reservation in Arizona. The soldiers themselves called it Hell's 40 Acres. It was a barren, sun-scorched wasteland where disease festered and rations were a cruel joke. Children starved, the elderly withered, the spirit of the people began to break. For 3 years they endured this living death, but the Apache are not a people who break easily. In 1880, Victorio could bear it no longer. He led his people out of hell and back into the fight, and at his side, as always, was Lozen. This was not just an escape. It was a declaration of war. Victorio's campaign began, a brilliant and brutal guerrilla war that would rage across New Mexico, Texas, and deep into Mexico. And Lozen was its linchpin. While Victorio was the brilliant tactician, Lozen was the spiritual compass. Before every engagement, she would perform her sacred rite, her hands outstretched, her chant rising into the desert sky. Her tingling palms and darkened veins would reveal the enemy's position, allowing the Apache to strike with supernatural precision. They ambushed cavalry patrols in narrow canyons, vanished into the vastness of the desert, and outmaneuvered forces 10 times their size. She was not only a seer but a fierce warrior, fighting on the front lines, her rifle and knife as deadly as any man. Her legend grew with every skirmish. In one instance, while the main band was engaged, Lozen took it upon herself to escort a pregnant woman across the treacherous Chihuahuan Desert to the safety of the Mescalero Reservation. Alone, she hunted for them both, killing a longhorn steer with nothing but her knife to avoid the sound of a gunshot. She stole horses from under the noses of Mexican vaqueros and navigated through enemy patrols, delivering the mother and newborn child to safety before riding back into the heart of the war. But the combined might of the U.S. and Mexican armies was a relentless tide. In October 1880, they cornered Victorio and his warriors at Tres Castillos in Mexico. In a devastating battle, Victorio and most of his men were killed. The heart of the resistance was ripped out, but the fight was not over. Lozen, who had been escorting another group to safety, was not at the battle. When she learned of her brother's death, her grief was a fire that forged her resolve anew. The surviving members of the band, now led by the ancient and cunning Nana, a warrior in his 70s, looked to her. The shield of the people had lost her right hand, but her own power was undiminished. The war for Apache freedom had entered its final, desperate chapter, and Lozen, the holy warrior, would see it to its bitter end. The news from Tres Castillos fell like a death shroud upon the survivors. Victorio was gone. The heart of the resistance had been torn out. For Lozen, the loss was a physical blow, a severing of spirit. But in the ashes of her grief, a new fire was kindled. The fight was not over. The band, now a scattered collection of widows, orphans, and a few warriors, looked to the oldest among them, Nana. A warrior from a bygone era, now in his 70s, lame in one foot and his body racked with rheumatism. Yet his eyes held the fire of 1,000 battles, and his mind for war was as cunning as ever. He and Lozen, the warrior and the seer, would now lead the resistance. In the blistering summer of 1881, they unleashed Nana's raid, a campaign of such impossible audacity it became legend. With a force that rarely numbered more than 40 warriors, and often as few as 15, they rode 1,000 miles through New Mexico. They were specters of vengeance. They struck a U.S. Army supply train, killed miners near Chloride, and raided ranches in the Lake Valley, melting back into the mountains before any response could be mustered. Over 1,000 U.S. soldiers and cavalrymen were sent to hunt them down, but they were chasing ghosts. Lozen's sacred power was their guide. Her outstretched hands rid the landscape, felt the presence of their hunters, and led the small band through impossible escapes. They fought a dozen battles against overwhelming odds and won. Every single one. But even ghosts can be worn down. The relentless pursuit pushed them back into the Sierra Madre Mountains of Mexico, a final refuge. It was here in this rugged wilderness that the last three Apaches came together. Nana and Lozen's band merged with the legendary Geronimo, a Bidancohi Apache shaman and war leader. Geronimo knew of Lozen's power and respected her as a peer. This was the final alliance, the last stand of the Iroquois people. For years they fought on, 100 people living in the high mountains, but the war was changing. It was no longer a war of battles, but of attrition. The U.S. Army, under General George Crook, employed Apache scouts to hunt their own people, a cruel but effective strategy. The warriors grew weary, and the cries of their starving families in the mountains echoed louder than any war cry. Hope for victory faded, replaced by a desperate hope for survival. It was then that Lozen took on her final role, alongside another respected female warrior, Dotes, who was fluent in English. She became a diplomat. Trusting their courage and integrity, Geronimo sent them as his emissaries to negotiate peace. They rode into the American camp, their heads held high to speak for their people. They brokered a deal. The leaders would accept 2 years of imprisonment in exchange for the safety and freedom of their people. It was a lie, a final, unforgivable betrayal. As Lozen and Dotes carried the terms back to their people, the U.S. government was already in motion. They rounded up every Iroquois they could find, even those living peacefully on the reservations, and forced them onto cattle cars. The entire tribe was being shipped to prisons in the humid swamps of Florida. The choice was no longer about war or peace. It was about dying alone in the mountains or rejoining their families in captivity. In September 1886, at Skeleton Canyon, Arizona, Geronimo, Nana, Lozen, and the last 34 free Apache warriors surrendered to the U.S. Army. They laid down their rifles not as defeated men and women, but as a people making the ultimate sacrifice for their kin. Lozen, the holy warrior, the shield of her people, became a prisoner of war. She was herded onto the train. The desert landscape she fought and bled was shrinking in the distance. Her final journey was to the Mount Vernon barracks in Alabama, a cage of humid air and disease, the great warrior who had lived a life of boundless freedom. would die in chains, a victim of tuberculosis 2 years later. Her war was over, but her story, a lost page of history, remains a testament to a spirit that could never truly be broken. Lozen died as she had lived for her final years, a prisoner of war far from the red earth and sacred mountains of her homeland. She succumbed to tuberculosis in the damp, for an air of an Alabama prison, her body caged, but her spirit untamed. There was no monument carved for her, no grand funeral. Her passing was a quiet end too. A life lived like a storm. And so the question remains, how could such a figure be so completely erased from the pages of history? A woman who was not only a fearless warrior, but a revered holy woman, a strategist, a diplomat, and a shield for her people. A woman her own chief, Victorio, called his right hand. The answer is as simple as it is unsettling. History is written by the victors. And in the story of the American West, there was no room for an Apache woman whose power and authority rivaled any man, and whose very existence was a defiant challenge to the new order. Her story was silent, buried under the legends of the very men she fought alongside and the generals who fought against her. But a story like Lozen's can only be buried for so long. They are rare in history and must have always been or tried to be erased from history. For that of Lozen's, it lives on in the oral traditions of the Apache people, a testament to a different kind of strength, a different kind of leadership. Her legacy is not one of victory in the traditional sense, but of an unbreakable will to survive, to protect, and to resist against impossible odds. She represents the countless forgotten voices of history, the women, the spiritual leaders, the warriors whose stories were deemed inconvenient. Lozen's life reminds us that the most powerful legends are not always the ones that are told the loudest. They are the ones that endure in the heart of a people, a quiet, eternal flame. The shield of the people may have fallen, but the spirit she protected lives on. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, like, and hit the bell.